Well, for our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Jeff here with something very intriguing, very special. Good friends. Ryan McLeod and Dan Neff are joining us, both partners at Wachtell Lipton. We've known them for quite a long time and have really enjoyed working with them so much over many years. The reason we reached out to them is there's been a number of things going on that we find interesting from a governance standpoint. Namely, there have been some things going on in Delaware. And some interesting papers have been written about some of the changes that have happened, not happened, how to think about them, what they mean. And so we are reaching out to them as usual for their wisdom and guidance. And while we have them, we'll, I'm sure, love talking about some other issues as well. Whatever we can get from our friends at Wachtell, we really appreciate Dan, you and Ryan joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Well, Mike, before we jump in with Ryan and Dan, what would you tell us about what's happening in the market?
Yeah, Maynard, today markets are a little bit of a mixed bag. You've got markets are pretty flattish, the equity markets and crude oils up about $1.20 a barrel, and we'll talk about that in a second. But really what we want to start to talk about is, I think when you look at this market, you have to look at from Thursday till today. And the reason I say Thursday is Wednesday you had a 50 basis point rate cut. Everything moved on Wednesday. And so I wanted to kind of give an idea of what things have done since then. And if you look at since then, S&P 500 and NASDAQ are both up less than 0.5%. The financial sector and the tech sector is actually down. Energy and crude oil are pretty flattish. And so I think what I'm trying to relay here is the markets seem to be dialing in that 50 basis rate cut. It moved initially, and now markets are kind of moving sideways. So it will be interesting to see where markets move here over the next couple of weeks. Now, as it relates to basically the bond market, as we talked about a little while ago, the Fed, lowered rates by 50 basis points. Market expectations for 24 is that they're going to cut by another 75 basis points, and for 25, market assumes that they're going to cut another 100 basis points. So that's the first point. The second point is if you look at the 2-year versus a 10-year yield, we've been talking about this for the last 6, 9, 12 months. It seems like forever. And the curve, the 2 versus 10-year curve was inverted. That's very unusual. That, the curve now is not inverted anymore. It's actually 20 basis, it's plus 20 basis points. And so the reason I bring this up is that we've moved so far. Typically, the 2 versus 10-year a year bond yield usually is around anywhere from 100 to 200 basis points. And right now we're at 20 basis points. And so I think the interesting thing about it is why have we moved to 20 basis points? I think why we're moving to 20 basis points is I think people expect that the Fed is going to cut additionally, and we've already laid that out. But the question is the U.S. economy going to be slowing? Is inflation going to be slowing? Is the employment going to be slowing? Those are going to be big factors to determine how quickly the Fed cuts rates. And if they do cut rates faster than expected, you're going to see that 2 versus 10-year spread start to widen even more dramatically. So something to keep an eye on. As it relates to crude oil, like I said, crude oil is up about $1.20 today. And it really is up today because OPEC, for two things. OPEC is raising their demand estimates for 2030 and 2050. For 2030, they're raising their global demand estimates to 113 million barrels a day, and for 2050 to 120 million barrels per day. And that's higher than they had before. And that compares to BP, that compares to the IEA, that look for oil demand a decade from now to start peaking. So very, very bullish thing for them. The second thing, and more important, is China. Basically, they injected a lot of stimulus in their economy. They basically have an aggressive plan to basically stimulate their economy. And as you know, that's one of the things that's been holding over the crude oil markets is that demand this year is going to be slowing down, specifically from China. China is reacting, and so crude oil's up on that. And remember, we've been talking about this for the last 2 to 3 weeks, is that net short interest and Brent oil is basically, it is net short interest. We've never seen that before, so bearish sentiment there. We're seeing a Mideast, crisis right now. It seems like, Israel, the tensions there continue to build up. And so, it's just all these things are kind of, have been working against crude oil, are starting to work for crude oil, and crude oil's managed to eke out a little bit of a gain this year so far. So that's a net positive. Now, the third thing we really wanted to talk about is, what has happened here in the last week with nuclear stocks. And first off, we'll start off with this week is Climate Week in New York. And so one of the things that's happened here in the last days preceding this is that 14 financial institutions and banks have decided that they're going to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. That was one of the news announcements, and that's a net positive. As we saw last week on last Friday, Constellation Energy struck a 20-year PPA with Microsoft. Most people think that PPA is well above market rates. Some thinking it's as high as $120 to $130 a megawatt. We don't know that yet. The stock reacted very positively. The stock was up over 20% last week. It put on around 15 to 16 billion in market cap in one day. And so that was one positive piece of nuclear news. The second thing is we're going to just give you a little bit of background. Palisades is going to be coming on in 2025. That's one of the nuclear facilities that was closed. And the last nuclear facility that's not been, that is still shuttered that most people think is going to be reopened is NextEra's Duane Arnold unit in Iowa. That's about a 600 megawatt unit. And so expect we're going to probably hear news on that. One of the things I also wanted to give you an idea of, like, everyone's been talking about NVIDIA this year, tech stocks, the Magnificent Seven, how well they've done. Well, let me give you an idea of the best performing stock this year. The best performing S&P stock this year is going to be Vistra. Vistra is up roughly 195%. Talon is not in the S&P 500, but it's up 190%. Constellation, who just struck the deal with Microsoft, is up 120, 125%. And so these 3 or 4 power names are up on average around 140% this year. NVIDIA, which is everyone's darling, is up around 145%. So these are truly growth stocks. These stocks have momentum. The last thing I'd probably want to tell you is that, one of the things we've been saying is that there's political and there's financial momentum behind these nuclear stocks. We didn't see this 3 and 4 years ago. We're seeing it today. And what's also interesting is, the Constellation, the Vistras, the NVIDIAs, all these guys that are, part of this power market theme are up substantially. But what we're starting to see creep into the market now is some of these industrial companies that are going to be making valves and all these other, parts of, for these data centers and for nuclear facilities. They're starting to catch a little bit of fire. Names like Flowserve is starting to get some interest. Crane, and Emerson. And so I just think, we're going to see a lot of momentum here. A lot of people are going to be looking at the beneficiaries, and they're starting to be the beneficiaries. The last thing we'd say, and we've said this for months, is that the electric utility sector is a growth sector. Energy demand is going to be increasing quite substantially over the next decade. And so even though utility stocks generally look like they're, I wouldn't say overvalued, they're just basically overbought. But I think they're going to be growth stocks. I think they're going to be bottom pullback. And so that's kind of the status in the markets right now. We had a 50 basis point cut last week. Equity markets really kind of are going sideways. And so, we've had all this nuclear news. So I think it was a really, really interesting week. And so we're really looking forward to hearing what Ryan and Dan have to say today. And with that, Maynard, we'll hand it back to you.
All right. Awesome. Well, I think Jeff and Mike, let's go ahead and jump in with the guys. Ryan and Dan, I did a very quick summary introduction to the complicated world that you're living in. But we did reach out to you because there have been some articles and papers and news coming out of Delaware law, Delaware precedent, that it's very intriguing. And as I say, when we see interesting legal issues, we always think of our friends at Wachtell. So we wanted to check in with you.
We appreciate it. Yeah, Delaware is a special place to me. I started my legal career there. I clerked for the Court of Chancery after law school before I came here. And I went there because it's sort of the locus of corporate law in the United States. And that law changes and evolves over time. It's a combination of the statute and what the courts do to interpret the statute. But it's been in the news quite a bit recently. There's been as will happen from time to time, a revolution in some of the case law that's come out of it. And some of what happened in the last 2 years or so, I think, ruffled some feathers in the market, or at least went contrary to what had been pretty longstanding market expectations on a few points. They also managed to get under the skin of some very loud, rich folks who started talking about reincorporating outside of Delaware. And I think between all of that, it's put Delaware probably more in the news than they would like to be.
Well, it's fascinating just, reading some of the articles, getting ready for today. It is a stunning amount of just the percentage of companies that are incorporated in Delaware, the number that are incorporated. each year, the fact that this is such an important industry, if you will, to the state. I mean, it's a fascinating feature of the Delaware landscape and of the corporate landscape more broadly.
It is. Something like a third of the state's revenue comes from corporate franchise fees and things like that. So Delaware has a very vested interest in making sure they maintain their position. But we as consumers of the law have a pretty vested interest in making sure it's understandable, predictable, and usable to our clients. And so there's always a conversation going on between, I think, the folks who make the law in Delaware and those who consume it in New York and everywhere else.
And the recent, Maynard, you make reference to a lot of publicity. The recent developments I put as part of a historical pattern where the corporate bar and the corporations who have such a vested interest, things go along quite smoothly. Delaware is admired for its expertise, the quality of the judges, and most importantly, or very importantly, the speed with which you can get a resolution by very sophisticated judges. And we go along pretty smoothly. And every, call it 10 or 15 years, there's a bump in the road. We had it in the late 80s, and we're in a phase where there's a bump in the road, and Ryan will talk about recent legislation to address what I think the corporations and the practitioners regard as a bump in the road. But this is, if you take a longer look, this is something which has happened over the years. And sometimes the judges are more activist than we thought. Sometimes and there's always been there's always been a split in some way between the activist judges and the judges who are very, very conservative and saying, predictability is really what the corporations prize.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the specific rulings that have happened, Ryan, and I'm assuming as you maybe give us some more details on this, there's the ruling and then there's the implications of the ruling, and people tend to see those potential implications, differently as they play them out in their own head, and that's what creates a little bit of the buzz / concern here. But maybe let's just talk about a couple of the rulings just so people have a sense of it.
Sure. Well, there were 3 rulings that prompted pretty significant legislative changes. 2 of them were technical, I'd say, pretty technical. One of them a little more consequential. So let me save that one for last. There was a ruling arising out of the Twitter litigation, actually, from the stockholder perspective, not the litigation we did to close the deal, but a stockholder suit that caused the court to issue, in an unusual procedural context, the opinion that provisions in merger agreements that could allow for lost premium damages were not exactly enforceable in the way most folks had actually been implementing them. One piece of legislation was designed to ensure that's still there. That's an important deterrent for folks who might be tempted to try to get out of their deals, because if they breach the merger agreement and there is no ability to force a closing for specific performance, the threat of very significant damages, the lost premium to the stockholders, is a big incentive to go through and do the deal. So the legislator cleaned that up. But it was a bit of a surprise because this issue has been around for years and years and years. Many, many merger agreements followed a relatively similar path. And the court maybe reached a little bit more than it needed to in deciding an application for attorney's fees, that these provisions were not enforceable. So the legislature has now cleaned that up. That's one. 2.
And Ryan, I don't mean to jump in, but just
please.
So for everybody who's following along, there were the rulings which created, I guess, some concern as to how these were going to play out, and then the legislature has proposed new language in the Delaware law that addresses these as kind of the whole way this deal took place. Yeah,
that's right. And that's not atypical. There was maybe it's worth just a moment to say there was quite a bit of news and agitation over these proposed amendments. They got way more attention in the press than normally happens, but there are amendments to the Delaware statute every year. Every year, the bar in Delaware tries to tinker with the statute to make sure it's up to date, that there are abrogations to court decisions where the legislature sort of thinks the courts didn't quite get it right or wants to just make a different policy choice. It's happened before. For example, a few years ago, the court authorized companies to adopt bylaws that would have provided for fee shifting in stockholder litigation. If stockholders sued and didn't win, these bylaws would have allowed the company to go seek its fees from the lawyers who brought the suit. The legislature overruled that after sort of an uprising among the plaintiffs' bar. So it's not atypical for the legislature to intercede when folks perceive there to be something that wasn't optimal about rulings. And that is what happened here.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long practice. It goes back to maybe the late 80s after the Van Gorkum case, which created personal liability or made clear that there, in fact, was personal liability. It was more than a theoretical possibility. The Delaware Bar submits proposed amendments to the legislature. And as a result of those changes, all the companies that we represent, all companies you represent, or virtually all of them, have a provision in their charters which say that directors will not be held liable for breach of their fiduciary duty if it's attributable to a breach of the duty of care. And that goes back to the late 80s, and that was a reaction to a decision which resulted in personal liability to the directors of the TransUnion Corporation from a deal that the Delaware Court greatly criticized, and particularly what they had to say about the directors' diligence in approving that deal. So this is part of a process, but as Ryan noted, this year, that process generated a tremendous amount of opposition, and oddly opposition, from a couple of the judges on the Chancery Court.
Yeah, one judge wrote a letter actually to the Corporation Law Council, to the General Assembly, to suggest that the changes were misguided and shouldn't be made. Another judge posted publicly about it on LinkedIn. Actually, did quite a bit of, in his usual way, a very thoughtful, thorough analysis of what the legislative amendments might mean. And it was just a very public process in a way that surprised me a little bit. I don't usually see judges in that kind of dialogue with the ongoing efforts to amend a statute that they'll have to ultimately interpret. But the Delaware Court is a little unusual among courts in the United States. Its judges are very active. They participate at conferences. They write academic papers. So it's not entirely out of sorts. It was, I do think, though, a little surprising to some folks. So the loss premium decision has been addressed. Another resulted from the Activision merger, and some stockholders challenged the efficacy of the board's approval of the merger agreement because they discovered in the course of looking at some documents that the draft merger agreement that went to the board for approval had blanks in it. It wasn't a complete draft. It didn't have the final consideration amount in it. And it didn't include certain disclosure schedules that ultimately would be appended to it. And the court, in what was really a ruling of first impression, because that issue had not actually been litigated before, said, this isn't good enough. There needs to be more in the merger agreement. That's what the statute requires for the board to actually approve it. And it effectively greenlit an action for conversion that effectively the stockholders, because the deal, of course, closed a while ago, had their stock illegally taken from them because the board had not properly authorized the agreement. Now, like I said, this hadn't been litigated before, so it was a new issue for the court, but it wasn't a new issue for practitioners who all the time have merger agreements in various states of completeness that go to a board when a deal's still little wrinkles are still being ironed out late into the night. You try to get your board together at a semi-reasonable time to have them approve the merger agreement when it's effectively substantially complete. And so one of the other amendments now authorizes expressly a board to properly approve a merger agreement as long as it's substantially complete, either in its form or in the fact that through other materials given to the board, the substantial details are provided to the directors. So again, a decision by the court, truly an issue of first impression, created a bunch of, I think, market uncertainty and also just abrasion for directors. But Dan, you should say a bit.
Well, the problem is you have your board meeting, let's call it, right after the market closes. On an afternoon, you're due to announce that before the market opens the next morning. And you're not done in terms of the paper signed. You work through the disclosure schedules, you work through a couple last minute points, which more often than not are not material. And what this decision did until rectified would have required everybody to have the 6 a.m. board meeting for 10 minutes to say, okay, we're now going to put the number in the agreement. We're going to change from code names for the parties to actual names. So it was procedural, but it was, it's very, very rare that you get to the 4:30 p.m. board meeting the day before next morning's announcement, with everything absolutely done. And the truth of the matter is, the corporate lawyers, the M&A lawyers, functioned the way the court objected to. Now, maybe they should have put the actual names in. Maybe they should have put the price in, but the parties certainly knew what the deal was. So this decision, and it has nothing to do with whether the directors fulfilled their responsibilities. It was a technical point, and a technical point raised, technical point now addressed with the legislation, and it saves all the directors a very early morning phone call, because it had nothing to do with the substance.
So this one seems so practical, for lack of a better way to describe it. Was the legislature fixing this one, was that at all kind of controversial, or was this a relatively easy one?
I think this piece was relatively easy. There was some flare-up about it, but most of the controversy came from the third decision, which was a decision involving Moelis and regarding the authority to enter into agreements with stockholders, providing for, among other things, consent rights over board action. So the controversy there was actually a law review article written a few years ago that said, effectively in sum and substance, a lot of corporations have outsourced their governance via contracts, not in the charter, not in the certificate, not in the bylaws, but contracts among stockholders that say this particular stockholder has a veto right over these kinds of transactions, or the board may not take this kind of action without the consent of this particular stockholder. They're not uncommon. And that form, that sort of consent right or ability to participate, even though you may not be a director or just a stockholder, it permeates a lot of different kinds of agreements. It's not just stockholder agreements with one large stockholder. It gets into settlements with activists. It can get into a lot of other things. The law review article, though, argued that this was an abdication of directorial authority under the statute. The statute provides that the business and affairs of every Delaware corporation is managed by or under the direction of a board of directors. The article, in its simplest form, said that's not true if you have contracts where the directors are saying we're giving up power to others. So longstanding tension in the law about when directors can pre-commit to certain strategies, or whether their fiduciary duties require them to preserve all optionality at all times. And this, I think, was born from the same basic controversy. But the court held effectively that the law review article was right, and that these kinds of agreements went too far and gave away too much board authority to the stockholder in question. The legislature then proposed amendments that were drafted by the corporate bar in Delaware that would just expressly authorize these sorts of agreements. Now, this kind of stuff happens in debt instruments all the time. Like I said, it happens in activist settlements. There were a lot of agreements that were suddenly suspect in the wake of the decision. And I think the bar felt it was pretty important that action be taken quickly, lest all of those agreements sort of be under siege, and the ability to enter into future ones also be suspect. So that drew quite a bit of controversy.
The problem, the statute says the directors are paramount. If the directors, and they should have the flexibility to amend as an example, the size of the board. They should. That's a constant. Often activist settlements will provide, first of all, we're going to put these two people on the board and we're going to nominate them for another year because we want to get a 2-year standstill. But we agreed that we're not going to expand the size of the board. Well, that is practical. There are 50 or 100 activist settlements every year, and they provide something like this. but it does take authority away from the board to make the decision. Now the board is ceding that authority to make a trade with the activists. But that was the Moelis case would toss that out, make it invalid. The legislation went and fixed it. It also comes up, combination of activism, but also private equity. If private equity invests 30% into a company, they're going to want some vetoes. They're not going to, and people give them the veto rights. These all of a sudden, and it got to be, I think the practice kept increasing because of the nature of what sort of transactions are driving the market. This decision triggered the legislation, proposed legislation. A couple of the judges got particularly upset about it, but ultimately it passed. So we are free to keep doing what we've been doing for a number of years.
So just so we're clear, the legislation put it back basically the same way it was right before the ruling. Is that the way to think about it?
The practice was never tested. I think we all knew that there's we're taking some discretion away from the board, but the board is in making those arrangements, the board would be exercising their discretion to give up some of their powers in trade for a workable settlement or a big investment from private equity. So the legislation clarifies something that I think the corporate bar had come to the view that it was quite okay to do because we all did it.
Is there, in a situation like that, just my own curiosity, I go to, well, to what extent can the board sign things or agree to things that limit their powers? Like, is there some sense of proportion in all that? They obviously couldn't contractually give away all their powers. Like, what if you're a board trying to think about how much is too much? Is that a debate you have in agreements like this?
Well, that's actually what I think is been overlooked the most in the discussion about these amendments, because there a lot of the critics of the amendments suggested this is a radical revision of the director-centric governance model. We are now allowing directors to be subservient to other interests just by a contract. The problem with that, as I perceive it, is that the new statute does not affect the director's fiduciary duties in entering into the contract. So, Maynard, to your great point, a board that's about to enter into a contract has to do so in compliance with its obligations. And so, yes, there would be a conversation about what's appropriate here. What's the give and the take? How badly do we need that 30% investment from this firm? And is that worth giving away these veto rights? And it's the same kind of business judgment decision that a board has to make all the time. And so the statute doesn't disrupt that at all. And that's sort of why I viewed all of this as a bit of a tempest in a teapot. I don't think this is any kind of radical revision to the way Delaware law has ever worked. It's really just the court was addressing something that hadn't quite been expressly litigated before. Court came out with a view that this is going a little too far under what the statute says. Legislatures clarified the statute. That's sort of how these things generally are supposed to work, in my view.
Yeah, the one interesting area where the board is not free to contract away their rights is in the poison pill area, because there was some once people got comfortable with the idea that the rights plans, poison pills, were valid, then the creative juices started, and people said, okay, well, what happens if the board turns over? Can the outgoing board preclude the next board from in terms of their exercise of the pill? Because the way around, and the takeover bid, the way around it is to change the board and have the new board redeem the rights plan. So people got creative and said, okay, you can't redeem the rights plan for 12 months, 18 months after there's a board change. The court said, no, you cannot constrain whoever is the board. You cannot constrain their ability to function, and that's going to stand.
Yeah.
I think that goes up to the Delaware Supreme Court, and that's not going to change. So there are some, to your question, Maynard, there are some limitations on what a board is free to do. They can't, at least in certain areas, they can't give away the store.
Do you think we had the ruling and then we have the legislative action on this third one here of what the board can contractually give away in terms of decision making or rights? Do you think what just transpired, is this going to make boards more cautious about these types of arrangements, or is your advice, no, we're just back to where we've always been, which is thoughtful, but not necessarily more concerned than we used to be? Like, what's the way for boards to think about this?
I don't think it changes how boards should think about it, but I do think boards will be more cautious for an entirely separate reason. Because actually, what the legislature's done is create some clarity. But there's a second thing going on, and maybe the decisions which Ryan discussed are a manifestation of this, which is that the Delaware courts, some portions of the Chancery Court, seem to be more willing to criticize, more willing to take a fresh look at practices that have gone on for a long time. And there is a level of and it's most intense, Ryan will talk about, it's most intense in the area of controlled company transactions. But there's a skepticism which is pretty palpable, and that does affect, and I think that's the override, that's in the atmosphere, and it does affect how boards should think about things.
Yeah, I'll just add on that point. Part of it is the nature of a common law system where you have courts making law, which we have in Delaware. That's how it's always been. But it's a little bit like the courts have to work with the ingredients they get. They have to work with the cases that come before them. There were a lot of changes in the law, sort of under the last Chief Justice Strine, that limited plaintiffs' lawyers' ability to attack arm's length third-party mergers. Those cases just are no longer good. They can get dismissed. There were new weapons, effectively, that the defense bar got from developments in the law, say 2010 to 2015, that really started to target those kinds of assaults. That means those cases aren't brought anymore. So what's now being brought are not third-party arm's length deals, but controller squeeze-outs, controller-related party transactions. And so you're seeing more scrutiny on it because, of course, that's what the courts are getting more. But I also think there is just a judicial philosophy that there's an inherent skepticism of large stockholders, sometimes particularly where there's a difference between their economic stake and their voting power. And the courts are really aggressively policing it. So we are seeing quite a bit of skepticism there across the board, and a lot of litigation activity.
The reason I said you have to look at this in a historical perspective, Ryan triggered something. You all will recall anytime you announced a merger, that particularly the target company would get sued for breach of fiduciary duty. The development that Ryan talked about has taken those off the table. So you're still going to get sued if you announce a deal, but it'll be some disclosure case. And to be a lot more practical than I'd like to be, those cases are a lot cheaper to get rid of than the fiduciary duty cases, because the Delaware court said we're not going to tolerate these breach of fiduciary cases that get filed 3 days after the deal's announced. And that coincided, or happened shortly after so many companies adopted exclusive jurisdiction bylaws. So what the corporates did, not only did they incorporate Delaware, but they said to Delaware, all right, we'll give you exclusivity on fiduciary duty claims, corporate opportunity claims. We'll give you, your courts, exclusivity. Somehow, as a result of that, or in connection with that, the bad litigation, the litigation that we would profoundly tell the boards as they were entering into merger agreement, by the way, by the end of the first week after announcement, you will be sued. We don't say that anymore. We say right after the proxy statement goes unfiled, you will be sued. But it's a less less costly to dispense with those. The other thing that happened, again, on my theory that there are ebbs and flows, there used to be this movement involving appraisal rights. And there were some pretty crazy decisions that the shareholders of the target company would bring an appraisal action, even though the deal had been shopped, investment bankers got involved. You'd announce a deal, and then a couple of people would hold out and take a big appraisal case through the year or so that it takes post-closing to get that. Our firm in particular fought those cases. Ultimately, we got some very good decisions from the Delaware courts, which took away that line of business. It had become a line of business. I think somebody raised a fund to just do appraisal cases. Part of it was that you could get like 8.5% interest while you waited for your money. And so it was a no-lose proposition. Delaware courts ultimately took that away.
Can I just ask you while we're on appraisal case, Dan, is that I'm suing because I don't think the selling board had a proper knowledge of the real value of the entity, and therefore I'm demanding an independent appraisal be brought in? Is that the way to think? Is that what that means?
No, it's a statutory proceeding that said, okay, you went through, you had your investment bankers, you had your board meetings, you didn't get enough price. The value of this company, by the way, to be measured without giving effect to change of control, the value of this company is a lot higher than the price you got. Pay me the true in cash, the true value of the company. It's in the statute. Any deal that's not all stock in Delaware is subject to these claims, these potential claims. And there was a span of 5 years where it was an attractive line of business for plaintiffs' lawyers. And we kept litigating these cases. We kept having these valuation proceedings, and we won. So we cleaned up the law there. The law got cleaned up on these plaintiff cases, attacking deals. But where we've and so it's a very there's always a lot happening with Delaware law, and so what we're talking about now is these attacks on boards, and there's which Ryan should probably embellish, talk a little bit further about the attacks on controlled companies, and then there's a second thing, which is the Caremark doctrine and the duty to supervise, which is also a current line of attack, which has been more productive for the plaintiffs than we wish.
On the control company point, part of the issue is Delaware has, just from a litigation perspective, effectively 3 standards of review. The vast run of things are governed by business judgment, which is super deferential. If the business judgment rule applies, the case will be dismissed. In the takeover context, it's intermediate scrutiny. It's a reasonableness test. Or did you reasonably try to maximize value? That's Revlon. Or did you reasonably defend the corporation against an unwanted takeover? That's UNICAP. But the third standard is entire fairness, which is effectively an opportunity for the court to second guess what the board did. The court assesses whether a transaction was fair, both from a procedural perspective and from an economic perspective. And the law has now developed to a place where any perceived conflict for a controller, a controlling stockholder, if the controller gets some kind of benefit that is non-ratable, as the court says, not the same as everyone else, that transaction is subject to review under that very, very aggressive plaintiff-friendly entire fairness standard, unless you have it approved both by a special committee of independent directors and a majority of the minority vote. For a deal, you can structure a deal to negotiate, like a true merger, you can structure within those confines. But if it's a controlling stockholder who's getting an employment agreement, it's a little bit different. If it's a controlling stockholder getting to use a corporate jet, that's a little bit different. Setting up a special committee to negotiate that and then a separate stockholder vote over it becomes very unworkable. And so I think we're going to see continued aggressive litigation on that front, because the Supreme Court just made clear in its match decision that all controller conflict claims must go through entire fairness review, absent those two preconditions.
So the litigation against Elon Musk's compensation may stand for the proposition that bad facts make bad law, but there were a number of holdings in that case that are worrisome to us. One is that you can be a controller at 15 or 20% ownership in a company. That's never been how we understood it. Two, the board should negotiate the compensation with now found to be a controller, very arm's length, very aggressively, which does not mirror our own experience. When you have a CEO, and let's put Elon Musk to the side, when you have a CEO, it's a lot more collaborative process than a pitched battle to find a way to compensate your CEO. Because if you leave blood on the floor from your negotiation, that does not augur well for going forward. So some of these cases have created some, in the controlled corporation sector, have created some real difficulty, and I don't think they're pragmatic. And it may be because the compensation, and the 50s of billions or whatever the number was, maybe that's what it is, but that's not how the case is written. And so I frankly am afraid that case can be used for more than it should be.
Yeah, the court has to use the tools it has, and that standard asks the court to look, did you replicate some arm's length thing? And again, in a deal, you can sort of understand that. That's a true negotiation where there's one thing and there's going to be a transaction or not. But in a compensation arena, it's just different. I mean, I'm curious for what you guys think. You guys do more advisory work than I do. I'm always fighting as the litigator here, but that's got to change the dynamic pretty significantly.
You can't have a compensation negotiation with your CEO, which leaves everybody feeling badly. I mean, you can have a merger agreement negotiation, which leaves people feeling, I guess what's the cliche is, it's been a good negotiation when nobody's happy. Well, that applies to a merger negotiation. It does not apply to a compensation decision. So and I think that's generated a lot of the pressure for people to at least publicly state that they want to move out of Delaware.
And this piece of it has not been addressed legislatively. This is happening as we talk, and has implications as we talk. Is that fair? Some of these controlled party discussions?
Yeah, that's right. This is real core fiduciary duty stuff that never was really addressed by the statute, and has always been regulated by the courts. And as I said, it is a common law system. It's you get movement in the law, but it takes a while. And there's a decision now, or a case now that's before the Delaware Supreme Court that involved an effort to leave Delaware. TripAdvisor sought to reincorporate outside of the state. Stockholders sued and said, this is a conflict transaction because the litigation environment in Nevada is more friendly to controllers than it is in Delaware. And therefore, the controller's decision to move the company to Nevada is a benefit uniquely conferred on the controller that should be subject to entire fairness review. The Court of Chancery sustained the claim and said, I'm not going to enjoin you, you can leave, but you may be subject to money damages if I determine that the move was not entirely fair. That's now before the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court will have an opportunity to speak on this issue a little bit. It may say, this isn't really what non-ratable benefits are about. This isn't really a conflict because everyone is being treated the same. Everyone had stock in the Delaware corporation. Now they're all going to have stock in a Nevada corporation. But we don't know. The court's hearing argument on it in a week or so. And so we won't get a decision for some time. But it's another opportunity for the Supreme Court to give us some learning on controlled company litigation.
If ever there was a bootstrap argument that because the controller wants it, therefore it's a non-ratable benefit. Really? But another thing that we see where the Delaware law has moved, I mean, because it's common law, a lot of it's common law, meaning you go case by case, and some of it's not written down, it's not statute, the judges decide. The area that I know a lot of the director clients that we all our firms deal with see this Caremark case, a duty of the board to supervise. And that started out in a decision by Chancellor Allen in 1996, which said you can only punish the directors for a breach of their duty to supervise if it's absolutely egregious, they knew what was going on, and they turned a blind eye to it. And Chancellor Allen, who we knew, he worked here after he left the bench, wrote words that were meant to say, this is a weapon to be used exceedingly rarely. But it hasn't, as time has gone on, and for quite a while, for 20, 25 years, that language was followed, and now it's not. You should talk about.
Yeah, I mean, for a little while, there were a few Caremark claims that were sustained pre-2015, but they were like really egregious, huge level of fraud. The audit committee never met. It was like some company took over a penny stock, some foreign company took over some penny stock company to get into the United States, didn't follow any governance rules at all. Like truly, it was truly egregious. That changed in the Bluebell Creamery decision, Marchand, where the Delaware Supreme Court reversed a dismissal that the Court of Chancery had issued rejecting one of these claims following a listeria outbreak at Bluebell Creameries. And the Supreme Court said, this looks like it's egregious. It's a monoline company. This is the one thing they do is sell food. The most important risk, the existential risk to the company is that its product is not safe, its food is not safe. The board didn't have a food safety committee. There were no materials that went before the board that expressly mentioned food safety. Now, who knows if the board actually got presentations on it? I would be willing to bet they did, but they weren't written down. And so they didn't get credit for it in this litigation posture. Now, that decision didn't impose liability or anything. It just sustained the claim. But the potential liability is huge. And so that case settled. Following that signal from the Supreme Court, the Court of Chancery has sustained a whole bunch of these claims. Everyone knows about the Boeing decision, of course, but there have been a lot of other ones. Some in the pharmaceutical companies against officers at McDonald's for HR violations. But a bunch of these claims that the court have said satisfy this standard, which, as originally articulated, was sort of only imaginable to be satisfied in the most extreme of circumstances, and now circumstances that are far less extreme.
All of this has conspired so that and I hear this from boards all the time, the time spent on risk management has gone up dramatically. It's in part, probably a large part, driven by there is a risk of liability, because if anything really, really bad happens to your company, and if you have a plant blow up, if you have a Macondo type event, rest assured there will be a claim that the board failed in its duty to supervise and its risk management function. Those claims, which used to be readily dismissible, seem to get more traction. And one of the problems, a big problem with those claims, is the director exoneration, exculpation provision, which I mentioned earlier, arguably doesn't apply to breaches of the duty to supervise. And so you can have the risk of personal liability on those. And so what that's done is, one, we devote more time to it. We do the risk management presentation. So you have to know what the major risks are and which part of management's responsible for which risk, and then how often do you go to the audit committee or some other risk committee to talk about it. And so you spend time. And the other place where it's shown up is how you do the minutes, mm-hmm. because not only do you have to do the work, but you have to write down that you did the work. And so for many years, our advice was keep your minutes relatively spare so that nobody, because if they're obvious, if every board meeting gets 1 or 2 pages, it's obvious that you're leaving things out. If, on the other hand, you write 10 pages, anything that's not covered clearly must not have happened. And so now the writing minutes has become more art form than ever, because you want to, on the one hand, you don't want to say everything that happened, particularly because the other rage in Delaware, these books and records demands, which I know we must field 2 or 3 a month at least in Delaware, where people want the minutes and a lot of other documentation. So what you write down in your minutes, you're not just writing for the other board members. So doing minutes has become challenging, and there are lots of judgments. You don't want to be too complete. You don't want to be too incomplete. You got to get credit for things that you looked at, and you have to understand how the board is monitoring risk, so that if anything terrible happens in your company, and look, bad things always happen. The question is, if you have the misfortune, if you're Boeing and they had 2 planes crash in a 9-month period, and that they settled that was a very expensive settlement. If the ice cream case, Bluebell, Marchand, that, if your product kills people, beware, because it's that, but that has triggered, and that's why I get complaints from directors to the effect that we don't get to spend time on the strategic direction of the company. We're doing this backward-looking stuff to make sure that we're monitoring all the risks, and a chunk of that is driven by the legal environment and by how this original Caremark case has morphed into something which has got the capability of biting people.
I know we've kind of hit the Caremark doctrine quite a bit, but I want to just stay on it just for a second. I mean, I know there's a duty to monitor, of care, and setting enterprise systems up, risk management systems. What do you guys think is the biggest risk, say, over the next 4, 5, 6 years, I guess, for corporations, for officers? Is it in AI? Where is there an area where there's a duty to care is going to be increasingly questioned?
Oh, I think AI and cybersecurity are going to be just the bells of the ball for every plaintiff's lawyer out there. And boards have, in my experience, been trying to get ahead of it and really trying to focus on it. But I think getting smart on that is going to just require a ton of time. And it's going to really be different for every company, because every company's interaction with those things will be pretty bespoke.
And it feels like it's really changing quite quickly. So once you finally get in front of it, it's changing again. So
exactly,
maybe talk about that as well.
Yeah, cybersecurity. I mean, the SEC is all over it. I still don't know how you get ahead of the curve on AI, but that's we could say yeah, watch out for it. But that's we're all trying to figure it out. Will you? I guess to be cynical about the really bad cases coming out of Caremark, where the motions to dismiss were denied. You're better if you take risks that have or fail to monitor and that have bad outcomes. It's much more dangerous if the result is people die. I mean, like ice cream, Boeing. If your business, I mean, there was a case from around 2010 from the financial crisis where Citigroup the board was sued for failure to keep away from the mortgage-backed securities and things, which almost put them under. And the Delaware court was very strong, said, that's a risk, but it's not the type of enterprise risk that we're going to hold people responsible for in liability. So to be a little too pragmatic, I think that's where if you have casualties, if you have human casualties, that's where it's going to be most dramatic. Because cybersecurity, I think a lot more people have problems than we read about. Although the SEC disclosure rules now, I guess, require you to speak 4 days after it starts, and in my experience, people don't know enough to say intelligent things at that point. So that's a risk where it's really challenging to counsel people.
Yeah, the Court of Chancery did dismiss a Caremark claim based on a cybersecurity problem at Starwood Hotels on the notion of sort of going back to Chancellor Chandler's decision in Citigroup, saying I could see how someone might be able to make out a claim here, but the board was trying to do something. This wasn't enough to actually sustain it. So they've held the line there, but I do think with things like AI and cybersecurity, the plaintiff's bar is going to keep coming at it. As for what to do, document that you're thinking about it. I mean, I hate to say it, but from the Caremark perspective, get in the minutes that the board got a session on this and is thinking about it, because you'll get credit for having tried. At core, the reason it's a non-exculpable claim is that you have to prove the board acted in bad faith to ultimately win it. And it's very hard to prove directors are acting in bad faith if there's a documented effort of their trying to get their arms around it and grapple with it.
Right, because the procedural context for Caremark claims is that the plaintiffs write everything they write and their complaints, and the defendants try to dismiss it. The standards actually matter in deciding these cases. The standard is you have to assume that everything in the complaint is true. Now, you can rebut that if you have stuff in the minutes or you have reports, attachments that went to the board. And so, we're in a world where if you document the actions that you've taken, you will be able to, even if it's ineptly done, because I said AI, I'm not sure what competent versus inept is going to be. We'll know in 2 or 3 years. But if you're trying, right? If you're trying and you're writing down that you're trying, I think you will come out of it just fine.
I wanted to zoom out a little bit and just get your all perspective of where does this leave Delaware competitively amongst other states? Ryan, you talked about some of the controlled company issues. Maybe just talk about how you think this leaves Delaware competitively, and then what are the other states kind of are there notable pros or cons for any particular state that are worth sharing?
I think this whole thing is good for Delaware. Ultimately, it's good for Delaware to be challenged a little bit. And I think the fact that there were responsive legislative action taken in response to some of those technical things relatively quickly, even over some opposition, proves the system is still working. And I think that's good. And it isn't a fundamental rewriting of the law or a change to the regime, but it's pragmatic, thoughtful, quick fixes. Delaware can do that really well, and it's always done that really well. Control companies are harder because there isn't a quick fix for that, and that's sort of the long ebb and flow of the law. We'll see where it lands. With respect to other states, a lot of them would love to get a piece of this business. It's a huge amount of money that Delaware gets, and others would like it. So Nevada's made a real push. Texas has made a real push. But at the end of the day, even if you have disagreements with the temperament or the judicial philosophy of the Delaware judges, as Dan said, they are fast. They are really sharp, and they are really committed to it. And that court system works in a way no other court has ever been able to replicate. The Texas Business Court, for example, is still going to have juries. Juries are a huge wild card in these kinds of situations, not because juries are great in a lot of capacities, but sophisticated fiduciary duty disputes are real tough for juries to process. Whereas in Delaware, you don't have that. You get knowledgeable chancellors and vice chancellors who are steeped in this stuff and who do it over and over again. So I'm skeptical of the legitimacy of these challenges. Certainly some people will try it. We'll see. That's good. Again, good for Delaware to have competition. But I don't think we're going to see a sea change. I might have thought differently if these amendments didn't pass. That really would have been a signal of a change, but they did. And so my confidence in the first state was buoyed by that.
Jeff, if you have a client who's on the wrong end of a merger agreement breach, pick a classic situation, you're certainly not going to go to a state where you're told, yes, we could get you on the docket. It'll take a year and a half. You could get, we've had, I go back to the Roman Haas Dow Chemical. We got expedited discovery and a court date 6 weeks later. And that deal closed because is scheduling, just the calendar is so critical. Same thing with Twitter against Elon Musk. The scheduling, the ability to get in front of a judge, and so you have all these discovery disputes, and the judges, you can get on once a week you get on the phone with the chancellors and vice chancellors, and they'll say, You got to produce this. You don't have to produce this. And we're holding you to the court date 6 weeks from now. When you're in the public markets, you can't wait a year and a half to get your day in court. And the jury aspect, that's, the people, the judges in Delaware are immensely sophisticated. Just do we think sometimes they're impractical? Yes. Do we work hard to try to convince them when they got it right and when they don't? Yes. But in these highly contested situations, speed and competence are critical, and no one's demonstrated that they have it other than Delaware. I had a case in one of the, I won't even name the states, but in one of those states that you named, and we had a judge who wasn't calling the question. It took 6 years to litigate something. You don't have that. And then you can't send these things to arbitration. We have a couple of those, and you want to wait a year and a half and then get a split the baby decision, which is what litigators tell you happens with arbitration. So there's a role, but there's certainly also a role for the corporations and the corporate bar to say, guys, you got to get it right, and you've got to stop the second guessing and the skepticism. One of the points that I've made in the past is, as the corporate governance has improved and people have gotten more and more fastidious about what they're doing, the skepticism by the court should not increase correspondingly. There should be a reverse. I mean, when I started to do this work, you had board members who would come in and say to the CEO, if that's what you want to do, let's just do it. And I won't tell you how many years ago that attitude prevailed, but it's certainly in this lawyer's memory. You don't have that right now. You have, everybody is very, very careful. And so one of our objections, concerns is that sometimes the skepticism of corporate behavior is misplaced, given the corporate behavior had, the degree of care exercised by boards has just gone up. Every once in a while, you'll see something absolutely crazy. You see it, when you see it. You're probably better off not identifying situations where you see it. But there are so many media outlets covering bad behavior that it's really, it's to my mind exceedingly rare and probably non-existent in the really big companies, because they know the degree of scrutiny which they're facing.
Guys, do you think you spend a lot of time, you mentioned it before, Dan, on activism? Is there an intersection between some of this stress we're talking about that the board would feel for various reasons, whether it's the control people or the Caremark type stress? Does that create opportunities? How does activism interact with that in your mind? Is somehow activism now have some more openings here, or what is there any interaction between those two forces?
There is, but as an ancillary point, not as a lead point. Activists, they're in the business of making money. You don't make money, and so there's a lot of challenges based on, quote, bad corporate governance, which somehow or other gets this phrased. Examples of bad governance are slow at board refreshment or having classified boards or dual class capitalization. Those are always an ancillary argument. You can't attack. You can try, but you're not going to succeed. It's hard, and I'll put the Exxon experience of a couple of years ago to the side, because that was in my view, that was a fluke, because there's activism over governance and over failure to foresee the end of oil, the end of fossil fuels. But you gotta have a theory that's going to make you money if you're going to be in the activism game for more than a brief period of time. And so the attack is the company is being run all wrong, and they've underperformed their peer group. And here is my strategy for how to perform better. And oh, by the way, look at they still have a classified board. They've got somebody who's been on the board for 20 years and is pushing 80 years old. But it's an oh, by the way, rather than the frontal assault, because you've got to persuade the stockholder group that if you make the change, you're going to be better off.
And you touched on it, Dan. That was my next question, which is in energy, which has facilities, it has operations, it's globally spread, it has policy, regulatory. There's so many things happening in energy. As you think about this from an energy board's perspective, something like the Caremark thing, does it have particular implications for an energy board?
I would say it's got to be paid careful attention to, but so far history is not treating well those companies, or the markets are not treating well those companies that said, okay, we've reached peak oil, or we're going to reach it in 2027, and therefore we have to adjust now. And those companies that backed off from fossil fuels, to generalize, haven't been treated well in the market. However, you have to be very clear. If you're an E&P company, you got to be very clear about, here's what I'm doing with my methane emissions. Here's what I'm doing with CO2, and to be very attentive to those issues, frankly, to make themselves more investable as the markets come back to understanding that these are good investments. So you do need to pay pretty careful attention, but I don't think, and I do read some of the things, a lot of industry commentary. I think it's a highly rational, probably a smart position to assume that fossil fuels will be with us for a while and work hard on curbing the externalities of that. But you have to pay attention. You have to have people have experts come and present and say, okay, what does the climate for fossil fuels look like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now? So that you're not accused of just having your head completely in the sand.
And write it down. Make sure it's in the minutes.
Right.
That's all those. We've moved to the regime of write everything down, and I guess we don't have to fill in the name of the selling company and the buying company. That's been cleaned up. We've got a lot of writing it down going on. But well, guys, this has been wonderfully informative, and I feel like we could go another hour on this. But last question as we wrap up is, as you think about this, it seems like you've painted a picture of Delaware has this sort of routine maintenance type function, and Delaware, periodically, like you mentioned, Dan, there's a little bit of disruption, like in the late 80s, but generally it has this highly commendable system. And the other thing you pointed to was the way in which, when you stop lawsuits in one area, they kind of start showing up in another area. And, that's just kind of the way it goes. People find reasons to sue. As you kind of project this out, we're always trying to think out on the horizon, and we always talk about 10 years. But as you guys project out corporate governance, trends in corporate governance, decision-making at the board level, do you have any particular observations on what corporate governance looks like out in the future? I realize this is a very difficult question, but because you painted a picture of pretty resilient system that does a good job of self-correcting. So maybe it's going to look very similar to today. But any thoughts about that question?
All of your points make sense to me. The plaintiff's bar is immensely creative. They find things, they take doctrines such as Caremark, which was designed to be a pressure release valve for the most egregious conduct, and they turn it into something that's, whenever you have something bad, they'll find that board, the board of the company. They've turned books and records demand, which we thought was to get at minutes if you really had a serious problem, and they've turned that into something routine. So I think that there'd be no end of challenges to the corporates. A lot's going to turn on the makeup of the judiciary because they have a real impact. I do think that there's such an enormous industry now studying boards, both you've got the proxy advisors, you've got whose business it is to issue pronouncements on governance. You've got the governance people in the passive institutional investors who are also monitoring. And so the meetings we used to, 15 years ago, the idea of independent directors meeting with the stockholders, we thought, no, that's crazy. And now if you don't do it, you're missing a bet. So what I see in governance is constant attack, because I think that's the realm we're in, constant shareholder proposals, independent directors on the front lines and talking to stockholders, which ultimately has some limitations because they're not running the business. So you're maxed out at a certain point because you can't have 12 people on your board coming to headquarters every day to learn how the company works. So I think that more of the same and more probing for openings, using old tools. Who would have thought appraisal rights would turn into a burgeoning industry, which it was for 5 years until we were able to shut it down. So I know there will be churn. I know there will be activity, probably using something which exists that we don't realize how valuable it can be made to be. So more of same. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a visionary, but I kind of regret in a way that the boards, which we counsel, I've spent a career counseling, spend a very large, I was going to say inordinate, I'll say a very large amount of their time playing defense. And I know directors are frustrated by that, and I'm frustrated by that because our corporations are the world's leaders for a reason. And and some of the playing defense is merited, some, but not to the extent it's reached.
And I'll just add, maybe not as a prediction, but an aspiration. I do hope we find a way to get directors a little bit of relief, because we have too many to-do lists for directors today. Like the audit committee alone is so overburdened almost at every company. And it's a lot of these little defense box checking sorts of things, instead of sitting around doing the work of what a board's supposed to be doing, which is figuring out how are we going to make money for our stockholders? How are we going to grow the company? So I hope we find a way to take some of the administrative burden down a little bit so they can get back to that core function.
We had a meeting recently just talking about exploration, and it was fascinating. There was a guy who stood up and he said, at my company 20 years ago, half of the board meeting was consumed about talking about exploration prospects. And, that was just a very different world for a lot of reasons. But, well, you guys have been fantastic. As always, we learn so much, and you make very complicated things easier to understand. And for that, we're very grateful. So thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.